And welcome. My name is Matthew Lee, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the leadership of the Stakeholder Interest Group at SMS, and particularly on behalf of Jiao, who co-organized this session with me. Let me, before I introduce our speaker, tell you a little bit about what we're trying to do here. Jiao and I were talking about research in this area and how there's lots of events and programming around new papers and conferences where people discuss working papers and such, but that there are a lot of really interesting books out there that touch on stakeholder-focused issues that don't really have a forum, or at least as much of a forum in our community. And so our idea here was to give a forum for authors to present their books, especially because these books are often presenting kind of big ideas. The book format is much more amenable to developing big ideas in many cases than individual papers. So we wanted to give those authors a forum and to create an opportunity for the constituents of the stakeholder group to learn about what these authors have been working on. So that's our goal. We've got a couple more speakers that we're lining up dates for, so you'll hear more about those in the days and weeks to come. Let's now turn to our first author, and it's my pleasure to introduce Chris Marquis, who will talk about his book, Better Business, How the B Corp Movement is Remaking Capitalism. Chris has been working on B Corps and the B Corp movement for a long time. Many of you are familiar with B Lab, obviously the parent organization that has developed this B Corp form and has been developing this movement over the last decade plus. And Chris has really gotten to know not only the organizers of the movement, but all of the individual B Corps, the B Corp process, the governance process, and has really interesting ideas about how this might fit into the future of capitalism. So we'll have Chris talk about his book for 25 minutes or so. We'll then have about 25 minutes of Q&A at the end of the session after Chris's presentation. With that, over to you, Chris.
Great. Well, thank you, Matt. Really so much appreciate the invitation from you and Jiao. Really excited to talk to all of you about my book. Let me share my screen here. Can you guys see that? We're good. All right. So, it's a honor to be the sort of kickoff of the series. I think, the inspiration behind it, sort of learning about books and big ideas makes a lot of sense. I, hope I can live up to that. I'm not sure, This book that I did, as Matt mentioned, I've been studying B Corps and B Lab for now over 10 years. And the book that I wrote, I would say, definitely underlying it is a research agenda, but also, draws a lot on the HBS case studies that I did on B Corps and B Lab. The overall argument is a stakeholder-oriented argument. So I think it really fits well with the Stakeholder Strategy Interest Group. Just to let you know, so even if you, don't care about or, aren't interested in B Corps, the ideas that I try to advance in the book is that the tools and processes that B Lab and B corporations have developed are really useful for all types of companies to use to implement a more stakeholder-oriented form of management. There's a lot of talk about need to move to stakeholder capitalism, companies be more stakeholder driven, but actually how to do that is another thing. And I think that actually the things that we'll talk about today, I write about the book, and the B Lab and B corporations have been pioneering is useful to do that. The talk is going to be very general, I think. It's not going to be like delivering a paper. And I will mention a couple areas where maybe there'll be some interesting teaching implications, maybe some interesting follow-up research implications, but just going to be a general overview of the book. And looking forward to questions and comments. As Matt mentioned, we can wait to the end. It's hard to see people's hands or chat. I can't actually see the chat at all, given that I'm sharing my screen. So if anyone has any burning questions, they should feel very welcome as well to just sort of blurt them out, and we can deal with them at that point too. Okay. So this idea of stakeholders, moving to a more fair and equitable economic system, so I wrote the book actually before COVID, but I think it's actually the ideas in it are even more important now than they were initially. You know, we've seen through the past year plus, you know, issues of resiliency in our economic systems, issues of social justice, discrimination in our social systems. And there's so much discussion now about the idea of sort of building back better, you know, as we exit COVID, you know, have an economy, having corporations and governance be much more sort of equitable and sustainable. And I think that, you know, that's actually what the focus of this book is. You know, thinking about stakeholders and stakeholder capitalism, I think that all of you on the call probably know this somewhat well. You know, this is sort of counterposed to the idea of shareholder primacy, Okay, someone muted me. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Yeah, so this idea of, you know, shareholder primacy frequently is said to stem from, you know, this Milton Friedman here, Nobel Prize winning economist from the University of Chicago, wrote this article in the New York Times Magazine called The Social Responsibility of Businesses to Increase Profits. I don't know if any of you have read this recently. There was a lot of discussion around it. It was reprinted less than 6 months ago on the 50th anniversary of it. It's really a pretty sort of strident and groundbreaking in many ways piece where he very powerfully says, you know, things like, you know, diversity, things like environmental protection, not the business of companies. Companies should focus on profit, their shareholders. If you know, we want to focus on those things, that should be the government, or that should be executives doing in their personal time. You know, really a radical idea at the time, interestingly. If you look at how organizations, businesses have developed, you know, he was really talking in somewhat reaction to managerial capitalism, where there was much more sort of, you know, corporate welfare around employees, generous pensions, you know, environmental programs also were engaged, you know, sort of engaged pretty extensively as well. And this is something where, you know, you think about, you know, what he's saying sort of sounds reasonable. However, you know, leads to many sort of, in some ways, second order problems that create bigger issues. One of which is stock options, which came about as a direct result of this through agency theory, and particularly in the 1980s with, you know, Jensen and Meckling and other papers, which we know of. And you know, if you look at actually how, you know, the effect of stock options on things like corporate pay, you know, you've heard in the last number of years about all the problems with economic inequality. I think that stock options and the movement from shareholder primacy and agency can really be implicated pretty directly in this. If you look at this graph here, you know, when Milton Friedman was writing, you know, corporate executive pay to average worker pay 20 to 1, you know, upwards close to 400 to 1 in some years, you know, really very much driven by this sort of tying of executives to short-term profit goals. Same thing with environmental issues. You know, if your, you know, pay is directly tied to, you know, next quarter share price, you know, much less likely to invest for the long run. Here's a sort of the cartoon interlude, sort of a little funny, you know, cartoon that illustrates this. You know, yeah, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment, we created a lot of value for shareholders. Actually, let's skip over this. So, you know, this is something that not even, you know, crazy business school professors are saying. This is something that even, you know, leading executives from the world's biggest companies are saying as well. You know, many of you probably heard, I'm sure you heard, given this is a Stakeholder Strategy Interest Group, in 2019, that the Business Roundtable, so these 200 largest companies in America, CEOs, they changed the statement of the purpose of the company to one where it's not just about meeting shareholder interests, but about the interests of all stakeholders, you know, including employees, communities, environment, et cetera. You know, this is something even folks as diverse as Elizabeth Warren and Marco Rubio talk about. You know, Elizabeth Warren, this was actually a centerpiece of her presidential campaign, Accountable Capitalism Act. Marco Rubio wrote this report here, American Investment for the 21st Century, where he identifies shareholder primacy as the cancer that's killing American competitiveness. So these are things that, you know, widespread from largest companies to politicians from both sides of the aisle. But this is very much, I think, easier said than done. You know, actually how to transition from a shareholder primacy focus to a stakeholder focus is hard. And I think, you know, a lot of companies get called out for greenwashing. You know, most famously recently is Marriott that signed on to that that business roundtable statement. And then in response to COVID, they did all these, you know, not sort of stakeholder oriented things to their employees, and then, you know, paid their board more, paid their, you know, senior executives more, and, you know, increased their dividends. So all, you know, suggesting that, you know, maybe they aren't actually, you know, buying into the statement as much as, you know, as it may appear. And I think, you know, I mean, I'm, you know, written on greenwashing, and certainly I think that many companies are trying to pull the wool over people's eyes. But I do think as well that it's actually a challenge. I mean, our laws are set up, our, you know, corporate markets are set up, our, you know, even sort of cognition is set up very much around this idea of shareholder primacy. And so I think this idea of trying to actually transition is hard for companies. And that's why I think that, you know, these B Corp tools are really useful, because it helps companies sort of measure, conceptualize, and be accountable to a broad set of stakeholders. So you can see here on this 2x2, the y-axis, you know, one important element is an ESG assessment tool. It's called the B Impact Assessment. And to become a B Corporation, companies have to get over 80 on this, although all companies can use this. You know, while there's only, you know, 4,000 B Corps, over 140,000 companies actually are using this tool. In the x-axis along the bottom, stakeholder governance. So this is a new type of company called a benefit corporation, whereby within sort of the corporate articles, the DNA of the company is a recognition that the company is accountable to broader sets of stakeholders, have a purpose beyond shareholders. So when you put both those together and the companies do well in the ESG management tool, they can become, you know, certified B corporations if they so wish. Lots of companies around the world that you know of, you know, from, you know, Patagonia to King Arthur Flour, you know, internationally, you know, like Natura, who, you know, you may have heard of, but if you haven't, it's a $10 billion Brazil-based cosmetics company. As the name suggests, focused on natural ingredients. It actually recently purchased Avon. It owns the Body Shop. So, you know, widespread types of companies. So this B Impact Assessment, what it is, it's, as I mentioned, it's sort of an ESG management tool, looking at things like, you know, governance, workers, customers, communities, the environment, et cetera. Again, like I mentioned, and it's something where, you know, companies fill it out, but then through a variety of means, it's sort of checked and assessed by B Lab. So it's not, you just don't say things, you actually get checked as well. Just at a high level to see how what this looks like. So you can see Patagonia, this is their high level report. As you can imagine, you know, Patagonia is well known for its sort of activism, environmentalism. So it does very well on environment and community factors. And it actually, the score of 151 is pretty high. You know, you can see here of the 140,000 companies that take it, about, you know, average is about 50. You have to get an 80 to certify, and so 151 is really pretty far off. One of the things that I think is interesting, and if you think about some of the research that can be done with this data, the data is publicly available for companies that become B Corps and not. And you can see how actually their scores improved over time. And actually the assessment gets harder over time. Every few years they revise it. And so, you know, this actually really fits well with, you know, many of you probably heard of this CEO and founder of BlackRock, Larry Fink, has been writing these letters to CEOs of the companies he invests in, and says, you know, you need to focus more on sustainability, on climate change, on measuring ESG factors. And his rationale is this, you know, creates pressure for improvement, long-term risk management. And in many ways, I think, you know, the Patagonia's work on this, and, you know, implicitly shows this in some ways, because they're actually, you know, as they're engaging in this, they're getting better over time, which many companies have told me that they've gone through this. So, you know, this idea of, you know, being sort of a better business, that's the title of the book. You know, I chose that sort of word consciously, because so many of the companies that I interviewed for this book said, we were really interested in, the social and environmental aspects of this. We wanted to be held accountable for things that we were saying, but actually we came out of it as a better business because of the, as I mentioned, and as Larry Fink says, the idea that if you're measuring, tracking, benchmarking on these different aspects of your business, it actually leads to better performance. So definitely, and this is another sort of research question I think that could be addressed in more detail with this data. One of the things that I found through this, sort of studying this this phenomena is that early on, so the first HBS case study I wrote on B Lab was in 2010, would teach it, and people would say, this is great for companies like Patagonia that are owned by like one person, but private, venture capital investors, private equity investors will never be interested in this. And so that actually was the case for a number of years, but more recently, the most high status, well-known, powerful VC firms have really gotten on board this movement in a powerful way. And we can talk about this more in the, in the Q&A, but you can see the list there. Many venture capital companies actually use that B impact assessment, that ESG assessment, as a form of due diligence for their deals. So, this is something where, really focusing on ESG factors helps assess business. You can see, just over the last few years, I mean, billions of dollars are flowing into these companies with a social mission. Also catching on in the public markets. So again, sort of early on when I taught on this, not only would investors never be interested, private investors like VC or PE firms, but like the idea that public markets would embrace socially focused businesses was seen as just like totally crazy, basically. But a number of companies have gone public recently, including Lemonade, which is an online insurer, Vital Farms, which is a pasture-raised egg and dairy company. Most recently is App Harvest, which you can see there just recently went public. Martha Stewart is an investor on the board. The reason being is that this is actually an indoor farming company. They have a 60-acre indoor farm in Kentucky, and I guess the produce that they produce is just such high quality and tastes so good is what sort of attracts Martha Stewart. So I guess following ESG not only leads to financial performance, but also to better sort of tasting food as well. Another part of this phenomenon I wanted to mention that has also started to take off is, if I want to invest in App Harvest, if I want to invest in Lemonade, that's something, I mean, that's disclosed in their S1, their filings with the Security Exchange Commission, that actually, if you look at those documents, they identify this as a potential risk because they are not sort of maximizing shareholder return. So as an investor, you can read those documents and choose to buy into this. But a number of companies recently, these are existing public companies, they have actually changed their incorporation form to a benefit corporation. So this is, you're already a shareholder and you're investing in a sort of C Corp, regular, shareholder maximizing company, and they take a vote and say, I'm going to transition into a stakeholder-driven company. And so two companies have done this recently, Viva and Amalgamated Bank. And I should actually mention, this is that axis, the type of governance, something called benefit corporation, which is slightly different than a B Corp, and I'll say a little bit about it. It's more in a second, but it's a legal type of company, like an LLC, like an S Corp, like a C Corp, like a sole proprietorship, but it has in some ways, stakeholder language baked into the DNA, the articles of incorporation of the company. And so the board of directors is accountable to all stakeholders, not just shareholders, as would be the case under more shareholder primacy focus. This is something that has literally spread around the world, started in the US with a number of states in the US, most importantly, Delaware, which is the home of much corporate law. is in Europe, Italy, France, our U.S. neighbors to the north in British Columbia have adopted this type of company, as well as a number of countries in Latin America, and most recently Rwanda. So it's many continents now have this new corporate type that recognizes stakeholders. I think actually looking at a research topic of looking at the diffusion of this model sort of within the US and around the world is a potential interesting thing to work on. Just very quickly, so I've mentioned, I mean, it might be a little confusing, I apologize. There's this certified B corporation, which is you have to get over an 80 on that certification and then be certified by this nonprofit that Matt mentioned at the outset, B Lab. Benefit corporation is a legal form of a company which exists in the states and countries that I mentioned. And both have sort of accountability and transparency at their core around purpose. However, I just wanted to highlight the difference as well. So in addition to this idea of just sort of being a better business, so to speak, what do these companies find as far as like the economic benefits? One is a huge set of effects around HR, culture, retention, attraction. This is another area, there have been studies that have looked at, sort of purpose more generally, CSR more generally on HR, but not sort of certified companies or benefit corporations in particular. So I think this is an area of future research. Many of the people that I talked to through the research for the book said, our retention rate, has really, gone through the roof in some ways because, we now basically, no one leaves. So we never really have to think about HR because, maybe we're occasionally, looking for a new, new employee because we're growing, but we're, very stable set of employment. Same with attraction. I found this among my students, many of which are sort of millennial and Gen Zs, talking about wanting to work for a purpose-driven company. And many of the companies I interviewed said the same thing, that at least 3 of them mentioned 25% as in their internal studies have of the prospective employees have noted the fact that they're a B corporation is why people have decided to apply to work for those places. One of the things that I want to mention that I learned through this, I was not very familiar with different ownership forms that exist of companies. I think in our field, we actually don't research that enough. I mean, we look at a lot of public companies, sometimes look at, venture cap VC companies, there's family-owned companies as well. There's a variety of various cooperative type of, Cabot Cheese was on one of my slides, or actually supplier-owned cooperative. Employee ownership is actually a tremendously interesting and important, I think, type of ownership. If you, just from a social justice perspective, basically any other form of ownership, most of the gains are actually going to a select few, whereas employee ownership, when the company's growing, company's prospering, actually employees are gaining as well. And so I think as far as, interesting thing to research is, this community has, lots of diversity as far as ownership forms, and sort of understanding how that affects a variety of strategy topics, I think is a useful thing to look at. Another thing that is so important in today's day and age are things like, diversity and inclusion. Just in the past years with Me Too, the highlights on the systemic racism that exists, actually going through something like an ESG measurement exercise is tremendously important for companies to understand how they fare in these issues. Many of the companies that I researched told me that, they were shocked. These are companies that most of the ones that get into it that are very socially and environmentally focused. When they went and actually sort of, ran the numbers in their company and actually tried to, sort of measure, track things like various, pay disparities, they were shocked to find actually there is huge pay disparities in many cases in their firms. And this is a thing that, is about sort of systemic discrimination, that it's not necessarily the decisions are made like consciously or sort of one-off, but actually they creep into these systems. And many of the companies I talked to said, wow, we were really surprised and have been working to actually fix this in our firm. So it's something where I feel that actually measuring these ESG factors is hugely important. Also, as we know, I mean, this is something that I show in some of the corporate presentations I show, but given we're all sort of academic researchers, know this idea that's how diversity not only is the right thing to do from a social justice perspective, but also from an economic perspective as well, as the tons of research across economics and psychology and sociology and various subfields and management from OBs to OT to strategy show that the companies are more innovative, perform better in a number of ways. Something that should emphasize, this is not just a US movement. It started in the US. For the first 5 years or so, it was mainly in the US. Now, over half of the B Corps are outside the US. The laws, as the previous slide showed, have spread tremendously. Everything from, I mentioned that Torah, Roshan is an Afghanistani telecommunications company. I think it's the largest employer in Afghanistan. A number of others. Body Shop I mentioned, which is owned by Natura. BDC, Business Development Bank of Canada. A lot of financial firms actually are B Corps. BDC actually uses the ESG assessment tool to assess its potential lendees. This is something actually also has been spreading to a lot of large companies as well. So another sort of objection I got when I first started studying this was that, like, yeah, but not only won't investors ever buy into this, but it's something that sort of maybe small companies can do, but actually large companies, it's a lot harder. So, many large companies have been focusing on this through their subsidiaries so far. So Unilever, you can see some of the subsidiaries. Danone has certified a lot of subsidiaries. And Danone itself is committed to becoming a B Corp by 2025. There's a number of large multinationals from, fragrance companies, Godovian, a Swiss fragrance company, to steel producer in Brazil. This is something where actually this movement into large companies is happening. And I think over the next decade, there'll be a lot more larger companies that focus on this. Okay. Another important aspect, I think, and it's something that's eminently researchable as well, is in regard to the UN SDGs. These are the 17 goals that the UN has articulated to either sort of fully accomplish or partially accomplish by 2030. Really trying to make a more sustainable and equitable, planet. The thing is, these, as many things with the UN, I mean, these are focused on societies, cities, not necessarily companies. They aren't really operationalized, so to speak, for companies. And so B Lab has actually synced up that ESG management tool, the BIA, with the SDGs. So companies, when they go through it, they can see, okay, here are the 3 SDGs that makes a lot of sense for us to focus on, and then track their performance against this. Also, it's great to see that the GRI recently synced up with the SDGs. So as these different tools actually continue to be synced, I think this is really important for us to help working on the same set of goals. Just finally, sort of last slide or two in the last point. One of the SDGs, SDG 12, is responsible consumption and production. And basically, this is all of us on this call, all of our students, all of our family and friends. It's about sort of understanding the sustainability of the companies that we are buying from and making decisions along those lines. I mean, it's something where many people around the world want to buy from sustainably produced, equity produced products and services, but it's actually hard to tell what those companies are. And this is where one of the ways I think that the B Corp logo is very useful, because companies can see which companies are producing in a sort of sustainable and equitable way, and we can in some ways put our own individual monies where our mouth is, because to achieve those SDGs and to actually become a more sustainable world, it's hugely important that each of us as individual consumers be thinking about these topics when we're buying. Lots of companies have been putting the B Corp logo on their products, which is positive in my opinion. So anyways, last point, just a little wrap up. This idea of becoming a B Corp or becoming like a B Corp, one of the arguments I make in some ways future-proofs your business, makes the company more sustainable, more resilient. And as I mentioned, this ESG management tool, helps the company be managed better, putting governance provisions for the long term, helps align itself with investors that care about this, affects the employee culture, and also educates consumers. So I know I've rushed through a lot there, and I really look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris. If there are questions, you can raise your hand, and then I'll call on you. Nicholas.
Hi, thanks, Chris, for this work and the presentation. I have a question about agency theory. So I'm wondering, how B Corps as a context can help us with our existing theories and explanations of things.
Sure.
So agency theory generally is about owners and principals, and are B Corps shifting that to principals representing stakeholders rather than only owners? Or in your last slide there, you talked about still aligning with investors, which seems to not extend beyond owners. How are you thinking about stakeholder groups as multiple principals who are represented by?
I think your framing of that fits well, and I think that's why, if you look at a lot of the critique of the broader sort of stakeholder capitalism movement from academic economists, very much. I mean, a good sort of summary of this is Gregory Mankiw had an op-ed in the New York Times maybe about a year ago. I mean, it's sort of along these agency theory ideas, and particularly accountability to mainly just the owners. That it's like, okay, profit is actually, or share price is like a really easy metric to optimize around. And if we stop optimizing around, his argument is we stop sort of really focusing on this one group and optimizing around share price, that the world will go to hell in a handbasket basically, because managers will just do whatever they want. I think thinking about things the way you mentioned it is a better way to think about it. That actually the corporation, the managers are held accountable to all stakeholders, or the stakeholders specifically they would then mention as part of becoming a benefit corporation. And then, there's metrics and ways to be held accountable to them. So I think it actually, as I think you said, sort of, broadens the idea of who in some ways the principals are.
Thank you.
Don Lang.
Hi, Chris. I'm just worried about unintended consequences in sort of a macro way of looking at things, and that for those of us who are very interested and committed to the idea that the stakeholder approach is the best way to run a business, doesn't it actually create kind of two sets of corporations? One who are committed to the stakeholder perspective, but the others who then are free to say that's not us. Or another way of putting this is, and if you go to Lynn Stout's book, where she argues that there's really nothing in the law that suggests that stakeholders do have, that shareholders do have primacy, then hasn't the B Corp movement actually inspired the change in the laws in the different states that you pointed out to make it seem as if you had to give special legal provisions for a corporation to worry about its stakeholders? And shouldn't we be thinking that all corporations should be worrying about their stakeholders and not creating and I'm not saying there's something wrong with the corporations that have committed to this. I think it's great. I'm just wondering if the whole movement might be having this unintended consequence of creating two tiers of firms.
Yeah. So good question. I think in some ways there is two tiers of firms, but I do think though that at least the argument I put forth in the book, and I think that how many of the people who are involved in this approach it, is not that all companies or even most companies should be B Corps. Some find value in that, but that actually there are a set of tools and processes, ESG management tools, I think the governance tool, are ways for all companies to actually become more stakeholder driven. For instance, one of the companies I mentioned, one of the companies that transitioned to a benefit corporation as an existing public company called Viva System, $40 billion cloud computing company. They're not a B Corp, but they find this sort of tool, which is a governance tool, useful. And I think actually, with all due respect to sort of my former colleague, Lynn Stout, the people that I've talked to, Chief Justice of the Delaware Supreme Court, and other people that write on this, that a key difference is the difference between the words can and should. So the way existing corporate law is written in many states, not all, there is wording that companies can look at broader sets of stakeholders if there's a long-term benefit for shareholders. So it's contingent on long-term benefit for shareholders. But where this law switches the verbiage to that they should. And so I think that's, and at least, I don't want to put, necessarily out the person, but some very senior legal person in the practice of law suggested to me that, professors say that it's not necessary, but every judge you talk to, since we're, sort of our legal system is, at least in the US, is a case law system. And there's clear case law that shows that companies are, there is a shareholder primacy mandate for companies. So I do think actually having this separate law is important, and hopefully more and more, hopefully that'll become the norm as opposed to regular types of companies.
Aline?
Oh, thanks for sharing all this. This is really fascinating. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about the diffusion of the BCore and the tools. And I loved how you showed these graphs with kind of the predominance in different countries. Right. And I'm wondering if we think about kind of how that process unrolls. For instance, if we have Natura becoming a B Corp, then all of a sudden do we get a boom in Brazil? In contrast, if we see things happen, like with Denon lately, does that really kind of cool down the interests of companies in France to adopt this? And also, how should we think about the role of kind of competition between standards like GRI when we're thinking about that diffusion process?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Eileen. Good, nice question. So I think you're totally right. I think that there is a clustering of this, and I think for instance, like to the Brazil Natura example, yeah, like for two other very large Brazilian companies, for instance, Magalu, which is a retailer, and Gerdau, which is a steel producer, I believe, have committed to becoming B Corps in Brazil. And I think it's Natura and in Latin America in general, there's a big sort of focus on this movement. This fusion more generally. I would say the hotspots, even more hot, I think, than the US, are Europe and Latin America. I think that the forms of capitalism, so to speak, that are in Europe and Latin America actually fit this ethos better than we still, even though there are a lot of, sort of US companies focused on stakeholder management, I think we still are sort of a, Wall Street focused country. So I see actually, and if you look at the large companies that are transitioning, they are mostly outside the US. So I see the center of gravity of this, if it is not more weighted in Europe and Latin America now, in the future, it will be, because it fits with the the sort of models of capitalism, so to speak, in those locations.
John?
Thank you, Chris. I was wondering too, what are you finding since you have been teaching this for many years in terms of the trends in how this is being received by your students?
Yeah, I mean, this is something, and this is actually why I ended up writing this book, believe it or not. So I don't know if Matt remembers this. Matt, was a student at HBS, and I think the first time I taught this class, the case study in 2010, invited the B Lab leaders to come, and the 3 people that founded B Lab came to class, and then thought, oh, we'd have some, sort of events across the river at Harvard College. There was some group that wanted to hold an event. And I think that sort of the people like me and Matt that were there were more than actually the founders, or like, it was like the founders were more than actually the number of audience participants. There were like 2 or 3 people came to meet these three people. I think it was either 2016 or 2017, I taught at Cornell and also invited one of the founders, J. Cohen Gilbert, to come and held a public event. And it was something where, I don't know how many people came, because it was, it was a room of about 100, 150. I mean, there were people sitting on the floor. There were people sort of pouring in through the doors to actually learn about this. So it's really been, tremendous as far as the, level of enthusiasm, of my students. And I think, it's interesting. There's, those of you who are interested in teaching on this, there's a great group called B Academics that is run. Joel Gieman, who you might know of, is involved in this. Also, Jessica, Jessica Thomas from NC State is the head of it, and she runs at NC State a lab for B Corps, sort of students working with B Corps. And I was talking to her recently about this, and she said she found the same thing. And she said she thinks one reason why she feels that it really has a lot of traction with students is that, it's sort of a thing that's measurable, identifiable. A lot of the brands that are involved in it resonate with the students. And so I think, from what I've found and from what other faculty have found, it seems to be something that really, students are quite interested in. Thank you, John, for that question.
I can jump in with a question here.
Sure.
So Chris, when I think about B Lab, one of the things that I think about a lot is this idea of how they're able to bring very diverse companies together under a single umbrella. So, if you think about the challenge of doing what they've done, it's a challenge of commensuration, right? How do you take Patagonia and a steel company in Brazil, right, and some other thing in Asia, and create this common identity around them? And so, thinking about when I first learned about B Lab in 2007 or so, thinking about why I thought they might fail, that was a big stumbling block that I thought there would be, but they seem to have pulled it off to a significant degree. So I wonder if, do you have any reflections on how they've been able to make this whole thing hang together? Are there any lessons from what they've done to accomplish that?
Yeah, really good question. I would say one of the things, I think they have been like part of their theory of change, so to speak, is that like the entrepreneurs and the business leaders at a grassroots are the key to this movement, and just like implicitly the sort of theoretical arc of the book is around like social movement theory, and so I think their mobilization process has been very conscious to focus on developing a committed grassroots and fostering a lot of community community work, which I think has been something to help hold it together. I think as they've transitioned internationally more, they've been very conscious of bringing into the governance people from all over the world, and that if you think, and now the ESG measurement tool that we had talked about, the B impact assessment, is now there's like 100 different flavors in some way because it varies based on geography, varies based on size of company, varies based on industry. And so, I think that both having grassroots and then also having this in some way tailored approach in the assessment is one way to try to make that bridge. So yeah, interesting question. Thank you, Matt.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. This is fascinating. So I have two questions. One is you had mentioned, well, actually a lot of us teaches this in the classroom. So if you have any recommendations for cases of yours or other people's, that'd be greatly appreciated on this topic. The second is you had touched upon this in the presentation as well as in the book in the chapter of big isn't always bad. Right. So in thinking about how do we move the BCorp model from ventures into big corporations, how do they actually make it work? When you're certifying a subsidiary, what does it look like? What are some of those challenges in the casework you've done? I'll be very curious to know that. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, good question. Thanks. So as far as teaching on this, so one thing I want to mention, so if you go to maybe just sort of Google the book or my website, I actually wrote a relatively extensive teaching note for the book that is based on, so I've taught this two different times, once before I finished the book and now sort of right after finishing the book. And so it's based on me going through it. I have a set of slides, which are not online, but I'm happy to send anyone, if you send me an email. I think it's about 200 slides that go through the whole sort of book. The teaching note actually, it does actually talk about how each chapter maps to a variety of different topics in the course, but then also lists a lot of other, case studies, YouTube videos, academic articles, HBR type articles. So I recommend, so thank you for asking that question, Zhao. I recommend, Googling that. That's one way to find some of the materials from a very diverse set of authors. Regarding your question about sort of spread to larger companies and sort of subsidiaries, ways of certifying subsidiaries. One of the cases I did actually is on Danone and how they certified. Actually, the largest B Corp currently is Danone's North America unit. It's a $6 billion company. Everything from Horizon organic milk, Silk soy milk, Oikos Greek yogurt, all kinds of Dannon as they call it in the US yogurt. So that might be a good, and I'm happy to send people that. If people send me an email, they can get it from the HBS website or HBSP website as well. And yeah, I'll stop there. People can certainly be in touch if you're interested in teaching it. I'm really happy to, provide any materials I can to help and talk people through things.
Ilya.
Thank you, Chris, for your presentation. If my understanding is correct, companies have to do this BigCorp certification periodically. And I assume there are some companies that got this certification once, but they failed subsequent certification. So can you comment on these companies that sort of tried it, but it did not work for them in long term?
Yeah, I don't have super systematic data on that, but I'll say a couple things. And so one thing is you're exactly right. So the certification used to be every 2 years. Now it's every 3 years. Companies have to do it. It actually gets harder over time as the certifying body B Lab has become more nuanced in understanding how to measure impact and particularly focus more on outcomes as opposed to processes. It's, many companies that I've interviewed have told me that it's actually much harder. So some companies do not qualify again, certifying. Some companies get annoyed at this. I actually emailed a company wanting to interview them, and they actually had not qualified again and were like mad that I had actually that I had contacted them. I just didn't realize, or I wouldn't have contacted them. They wouldn't talk to me. I was actually really interested to talk to them then, but they sort of stopped replying to my emails. Some companies, it just isn't for them. There is a fee involved with it, and so they feel like, okay, we signed up for this, and we we hope to get these advantages from it, and so that's certainly some. I don't think there's a ton of that, although that's something that needs to be identified more. One of the things that is a big hurdle beyond just the certification is the need to change your corporate governance. So this benefit corporation law that I mentioned also. So if a company is certified, if a company passes the threshold on the ESG tool and they apply to become certified, they actually have to change their corporate governance articles of incorporation within a certain period of time. And some companies, either their investors don't want to do it, their board doesn't want to do it. So that's actually a big reason why a number of companies end up they initially certify, but then they decertify.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
Marina.
Hello, Chris. Thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Marina.
I was wondering how the stakeholders see these B Corp companies. So how they deal with them once they become B Corp, how the stakeholders, for example, the nonprofit organizations, I think it's easier to deal with them, but do you know something about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's variation across the different stakeholders. So, I commented a little bit on the, on the employees. I think that for the most part, there's research on, social mission and CSR and employee engagement and retention and attraction. So I think, the fact that it actually has positive effects on employees is not that surprising given the long body of research that's done that. About consumers, I ended with this sort of call for all of us to be conscious consumers in some way. That's something where I don't think that there's strong evidence yet that actually the consumers are responding. I think that there is indications that maybe they're responding more than they used to, but actually widespread people are buying these products because they're B Corps. I don't see that yet. Maybe that's where things are going. Suppliers, I think this is something where, actually some of the folks I've talked to actually run into some issues with their suppliers because, part of the idea is to push these social impact ESG factors down in the supply chain. And so there's some resistance sometimes from some suppliers. NGOs and communities, I'm not as sure about. I would guess that as these companies are being assessed on their community engagement, there's more community focus, but I don't have any evidence on that one per se. So thank you for the question.
John.
You're muted, I think, John.
So part of the idea is that the big corporations want to be also a catalyst to transform business more widely. So this ties into the prior question about the two types of corporations. I suppose the vision is that ideally you would want to make an influence so that all become sort of like big corporations. So do you see that happening, or is there evidence that something like that is happening? And maybe a parallel question is also, and what's the role of government? Can this be happening
Sure.
in the private sector?
Sure. So I do think there is a good evidence that more and more companies are engaging with this. So like I mentioned, there's a couple, just 3,000-4,000 B Corps, but over 140,000 companies are using the ESG tool on a regular basis. Many banks, financial, like VC firms are using it to screen their investments, not to make them more socially responsible per se, but again, it's sort of this logic of Larry Fink that actually by measuring, tracking, reporting, and being transparent on these issues, it leads to more rigorous management, leads to lower long-term risk. So I do think that there is, again, sort of the idea of the book, and I think of this movement, is that all companies should be thinking about these, becoming more stakeholder responsive, and that these are some tools too. And so, I think it's great to see a number of companies that are not, many more companies that are not B Corps using it that are. Your second point about government, I think government has a huge role to play in this. I mean, I think that, it's, like I think the benefit corporation laws are hugely important. And I think that just focusing on, I think that actually the private markets and even things like the SEC focus on ESG management. As companies should report, the new incoming chairman of the SEC is talking about we need more environmental reporting of firms. Actually, I have an op-ed that's been accepted and it'll be coming out in the Hill. Maybe today it'll be out, which argues that actually focusing on ESG management is a half step at best. That actually, if Joe Biden, who has said he wants to transition from shareholder to stakeholder capitalism, you need to do much more than just ESG management. You need to, have, like Elizabeth Warren's Accountable Capitalism Act, where companies are actually legally accountable to broader sets of stakeholders. So I think there's a huge role of government. John, thank you for the question.
Okay, we've got 2 more questions. So I'm going to ask Gunter and Yunhee to ask their questions, and then I'll ask Chris to answer those 2 questions, and if he has any concluding words as we wrap up.
Sure thing.
So first Gunter and then Yunhee.
Hi, Chris. My question is, did you also look at moral questions in the stakeholder management approach? Because my experience tells me the more stakeholders you try to serve, the more you have moral dilemma to solve. For example, how do you create distributional justice between the stakeholders? To whom should I give more and to whom should I give less? Because at the end of the day, it's a zero-sum game.
Sure. And so, Yunhee, do you want to say your question too, as Matt said, and then?
Yeah, so thank you, Chris. I have a quick question. You mentioned the fee, and if I saw it right, it's around $50K to get BCorp B Lab certification. Why is it so expensive?
So I don't know the exact fees, but it's scaled based on their size, and I think 50,000 is the max. So when you have like a $50 billion, or excuse me, a $6 billion company like Danone North America, they pay 50,000. I don't believe that small companies are not paying 50,000. Small companies are paying, in many cases, if they're very small, virtually nothing. So it scales very much based on the size of the company. And then to the, just quickly, that's sort of a factual question. I think that the idea of sort of distributional justice across different stakeholders is hugely important. I think actually these data provide a way to sort of try to unpack and understand that for maybe others, empirical research. I did not look at that tremendously, but I do recognize that it's something that is important. Usually many of these companies, they have 1 or 2 key areas they're focusing on, like, Patagonia is really focused on the environment. So they, they have right advocacy around that, consumers facing work. So mostly I found companies, they have like 1 core focus, and then they try, they are doing well in the others. But I think you're right. I think that's something that is an important thing to study more in the future. So I think, Matt, you said I should wrap things up as well. And so, yeah, I just want to thank everyone for attending, for the questions, for the comments. Like I mentioned, this is something that I've taught a bunch, and I'm happy to help, share materials and, advice to anyone if you want to send me an email. So thanks again. Thank you again, Matt and Jal, for the invitation.
Let's thank Chris. And thanks from me on behalf of all the organizers to all of you for attending this first session. You'll see more information about our coming sessions via the usual channels, AOM listservs, the SMS website, etc. Please also, Emily has posted a survey in the chat. So if you have a moment to fill that out, that would be great. Thank you, and see you all around.